has been a while since I read a book, hence the lack of book discussions on the channel. But I finished this book lately, On the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. This is one of the 2 books that I brought along with me for this vacation. This book actually has 2 works of Nietzsche, the Genealogy of Morals and Ecce Homo, but I only read the Genealogy of Morals. And in this video, we're going to be discussing that. Before we continue, I just wanted to say something. I have been really interested in philosophy lately, but I don't think I've acquired enough knowledge of the subject, especially on Nietzsche's work. This, in fact, is the first time that I've read Nietzsche's book. So anything that I'll be discussing in the video is coming from a new student of Nietzsche and philosophy in general. This is just based from my understanding. I don't, in fact, claim that any of these thoughts that I'm about to say are true. In fact, I may have understand everything wrong. This is just my personal take on his work. So just take that in mind, because I don't want to offend people who's dedicated their lives studying philosophy or Nietzsche. So the Genealogy of Morals is divided in 3 essays. The first essay is centered on the history of conscience. He discussed the concept of evil, resentment, spiritual revenge, patience, forgiveness. On page 33, he discussed this when he said, "But it is only fair to add that he was on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence, the priestly form, that man first became an interesting animal. And only here did the human soul in higher sense acquire depth and become evil." I want to relate this to a song actually from BTS. Yes, the K-pop group. They have a song called And in that song, they discuss the concept of anger as something that is actually a good thing, and that anger is the driving force of change. It gets misused in the hands of people who relates anger to violence. I think Nietzsche is also saying that evil is not something to be scared of. It's something that is not exactly a bad thing, and it's not exactly something to be ashamed of or something to be afraid of or some type of dirt that you need to get rid of. It's part of human nature, and in fact, it's what makes us humans interesting in the first place and what makes humans superior to other type of animals. Nietzsche also discussed the concept of spiritual revenge. This is a very famous discussion that rooted from Nietzsche, and actually this is the reason why I got interested in Nietzsche when I read this as an excerpt in another book. On page 34 of my copy, he said, "It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, that good equates noble, noble equates powerful, powerful equates to beautiful, happy, and beloved of God, saying that the poor, lonely alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God. Blessedness is for them alone, and you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity." He said that Christianity is the religion of the slaves, and it was the perfect revenge of the Jews who were oppressed at the time. He also commented on Jesus as the Redeemer. Was he not this seduction in its most uncanny and irresistible form, a seduction and bypath to precisely those Jewish values and new ideals? Did Israel not attain the ultimate goal of its sublime vengefulness precisely through the bypath of this Redeemer? I know it's a controversial conversation criticizing the church and Christianity, but I actually have something to say about that. I'll tell that at the end of the video. Coming from a very religious and Catholic-centered country and community. This video might even put me in a bad light, but yeah, like I said, I'll be talking about Christianity towards the end of the video, and it's not actually as bad as you think. He also talks about resentment by saying that the slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. This resentment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. This just sums up the whole idea that the Jews created this revenge by creating a religion that centers around the belief of God, and by creating a system of values dividing conscience between good and bad. It's really hard to explain it, and I might not be using the right words to explain it. I might just say it in the wrong way and offend some people. I really suggest that you read the text first and then discuss with me. Or if you've read the book, tell me what you think, if I'm even interpreting that right. I also want to relate that on page 47 when he discussed patience and forgiveness, when he said, "The inoffensiveness of the weak man, even the cowardice of which he has so much, his lingering at the door, his being ineluctably compelled to wait, here acquires flattering names such as patience, and are even called virtue itself. His inability for revenge is called unwillingness to revenge, perhaps even forgiveness. They tell me their misery is a sign of being chosen by God. One beats the dog one likes best." So all of this was discussed in the first essay, but I also want to relate to that another text that is actually in the second essay, when he said, "If something is to stay in the memory, it must be burned in. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. All this has its origin in the instinct that realized that pain is the most powerful aid to mnemonics." So here he directly discussed what conscience is according to him, and it's just this memory that is burned in to the brain from someone who caused it in the first place, which could be the Jews, the slaves, the church, the religion, whatever sort of higher entity that carved pain to your memory. That's what conscience is, according to him. So now we're done with the first essay. That's all I want to say. I sort of just took the best ones, or the most that I understood out of the first essay. The second essay basically discussed the concept of debt, of guilt, of conscience, the concept of debtor and creditor, which is the origin of it all. He discussed punishment, obedience, irredeemable debt, the rising of a new heaven, the creation of a herd. All of that was discussed in the second essay. Now let's dive into that. So earlier we discussed what conscience is, but here he discussed where conscience came from, and he said that it came from the concept of a debtor and a creditor. When a debtor makes a contract with the creditor and pledged that if he should fail to repay, he would substitute something else that he possessed, something he had control over, for example, his body, his wife, his freedom, or even his life. The creditor could inflict every kind of indignity and torture upon the body of the debtor. So relate that on page 68. Perhaps the possibility may even be allowed that this joy in cruelty does not really have to have died out. If pain hurts more today, it simply requires a certain sublimation, that is to say, that has to appear translated into the imaginative and physical, and adorned with such innocent names that even the tenderest and most hypocritical conscience is not suspicious of them. He's saying that if one cannot pay, the other has the right to take something of his possession, or to punish the debtor who was not able to pay. In the earlier times, punishment is more severe, it's more violent. But now that we can't really kill someone out of debt anymore or inflict physical punishment, we thus have a different name for it to make it more subtle. And that name could be the law, or in a more appropriate term, acceptable term, we call that punishment conscience, or bad conscience, that you owe something to somebody, that you weren't able to do a duty or an obligation, that internal suffering. I also want to relate this concept of debtor and creditor to the concept of the present generation and the ancestors, which he also discussed on page 89. It is only through the sacrifices and accomplishments of the ancestors that the tribe exists, that one has to pay them back with sacrifices and accomplishments. One thus recognizes a debt that constantly grows greater. In the end, the ancestor must necessarily be transfigured into a god. Perhaps this is even the origin of the gods, an origin therefore out of fear. So he's saying that God supposedly is not an entity. It is this concept of debt that we owe. Am I making sense? Sometimes I think I understand something and I feel like I don't really. So it's really hard for me to discuss these topics because they just don't make sense. I don't think they make sense. But in my head, I know they do. But I just can't put them into words. Yeah, in the words of Hess from his book Siddhartha, he said that language is the lowest form of communication. I really believe that. So anyway, going back, the concept of debt, he further discussed it on page 91 and 92. And I want to discuss this part because I think this is the core of the second essay. Irredeemable debt gives rise to the concept of irredeemable penance. And here he finally brings back conscience, bad conscience. So this debt that we think we owe to the creditor, we self-internalize that, we self-punish, and we feel like we have to carry this punishment throughout our lives. I think I can relate this to a Christian teaching about the concept of the original sin. Before we were even born, we are already sinful, that we owe something. He further said, the creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor out of love for his debtor. So that translates to self-tormenting. We are imprisoned in the state so as to be tamed. That's according to Nietzsche. He expanded to not just religion, not just Christianity, but he also expanded to the concept of a herd or a state. So as a perfect example, he discussed the famous story of King Vishvamitra, who through millennia of self-torture acquired such a feeling of power and self-confidence that he endeavored to build a new heaven, the uncanny symbol of the most ancient and most recent experience of philosophers on earth. Whoever has at some time built a new heaven has found the power to do so only in his own hell. On page 135, he also discussed this, I think. The formative of a herd is a significant victory and advance in the struggle against depression. He said, the strong are as naturally inclined to separate as the weak are to congregate. That's actually on the third essay, but I just wanted to add that because I think we can relate that sentence to the concept of a state, the concept of a herd. Now finally, we are on the third essay, and here he discussed beauty and the concept of art versus the artist, and if one can be separated to the other. He discussed the concept of the sick being the debtor, the concept of indigestion, sick being the weak, again, the creation of a herd. I already said this before. He also has an advice to philosophers, and he basically wrapped up his ideas and this entire book. He also discussed the gay science. The third essay is my favorite essay from this book, and especially this topic when he discussed the concept of art versus the artist, and if one can exist without the other. He believed that the art can exist outside of the artist, but I beg to differ. I have a different perception when it comes to art. Art to me is not an object. Art to me is the interpretation of a visual representation of that. By the strict definition of art, you can separate the art from the artist, but I don't think you can fully understand the art without the artist. You can understand it at some level, but by then it becomes your art and not the artist's. Art is not the object, but the interpretation. Needless to say, I think having a favorite art is premature at all times, because once we know the artist, it is inevitable that we understand his art. Once we find meaning in something, it's impossible to dislike it altogether. Thus, all bad art is just unrealized discovery, and you cannot separate art from the artist. The artist simply shifts to your perspective. So that's my take on that. I really enjoyed dissecting that idea because I'm also very interested in art. Anyway, moving on. The concept of sick. Nietzsche said that the sick is actually the debtor because it causes self-punishment, aka bad conscience, and the concept of irredeemable debt, which in turn materializes to the creation of new heaven, or could be a new state, or a new religion, or in a more controversial term, could lead to the creation of a god. Hence, all of this is under the umbrella of the sick. And sick, according to Nietzsche on page 122, is actually the most dangerous. On page 129, he said that sinfulness is not a fact, but merely the interpretation of a fact. He said that it is a psychological pain and not a fact, only an interpretation, a causal interpretation of facts that have defied exact formulation. Too vague to be scientifically serious, a fat word replacing a very thin question mark. It's like when a strong and well-constituted man digests his experiences, as he digests his meals even when he has to swallow some tough morsels. If he cannot get over an experience and have done with it, this kind of indigestion is as much psychological as is the other. So finally, after discussing all of that, he gave advice to philosophers. We should think of an eye that is completely unthinkable, an eye turned in no particular direction. Basically saying that we should be open to hear both sides. But then, on page 135, he said that, I do not like weary and played out people who wrap themselves in wisdom and look objective. So I don't know which is which. Am I interpreting that right? Is that confusing at all? It's just confusing to me because I didn't understand it. But whatever, we're leaving that floating. Let me know your thoughts because I have no idea. So finally, he discussed Christianity on the third essay. Christianity alienates more than it seduces. It's come to a point where Christianity alienates more than it seduces. On some level, I agree, although it's a controversial opinion. By the way, I just want to add, when he discussed the concept of a herd, I forgot to mention that. I think he indirectly criticized Confucius, because Confucius believes that a state is more powerful, or a herd is more powerful than an individual. But Nietzsche said that the powerful, the strong ones usually like to be alone, and the weak ones need a herd or need to congregate, he said. So they're quite opposing ideas, I guess. So he also discussed his book Gay Science, which is something that I want to read, but I can't find a copy. Basically, the quote, God is dead, came from Gay Science, and he discussed that as having nothing to believe in is actually more dangerous. He said, we men of knowledge have gradually come to mistrust believers of all kinds. Our mistrust has gradually brought us to make inferences the reverse of those of former days. Wherever the strength of a faith is more prominently displayed, we infer a certain weakness and demonstrability, even the improbability of what is believed. We too do not deny that faith makes blessed, but it's precisely why we deny that faith proves anything. A strong faith that makes blessed raises suspicion against that which is believed. It does not believe truth. It establishes a certain probability of deception. I think it's funny that he criticizes religion, but then asks you to believe in one. Otherwise, you're lost. It's just a constant bouncing of ideas that makes this entire book confusing. It might even make you believe that Nietzsche is also confused himself. I think that's the beauty in it. You know, nobody knows. Nobody will get it. Nobody will absolutely get it. His intention wasn't to criticize Christianity to a point where he wants it gone or he wants it obliterated. To summarize my thoughts, this is what I said. He did not suggest an answer, but he suggested the depth of the question. This entire book is just making you think or encouraging you to think, but he's not telling you what to think, because at the end, I think the overall arc of this is him telling you not believe what he says. He only dissected Christianity the most because Christianity is the perfect example, because it preaches an answer. And though he does not despise the religion at all, it's what I believe in fact, he discussed the importance of God, especially in gay science. He certainly despised the idea of self-imposed guilt to understand suffering. But believing in something, though nothing, he calls this will, certainly defeats not believing in anything at all, thus circling back to the importance of having a God. In the last chapter, actually I think the second to last paragraph, he summarized his entire thoughts when he said that a man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. He's not telling you the answer. He's just telling you to ask a question. I think that's like the whole point of this book. Although again, I'm not sure because I'm not an expert on anything, on Nietzsche or philosophy. I have no idea what I'm talking about this entire time. So overall, I really liked the book. I enjoyed it. Didn't think I would. I first started reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra. A lot of people recommended to read that first, but my brain just can't handle it. So I'm glad that I started with this one. I think it's a pretty good start. Like I said before, whenever I'm getting to a conclusion, I end up retracing my steps and doubling back, as if reaching the conclusion is not the intention of this book. Like I said, he probably confused himself. That's why he summarized his entire book at the end. Honestly, if you're just, an ordinary person who's not interested in philosophy or making your life miserable, I don't really recommend you reading this. There's really no point. Just enjoy your life. But if you're interested in giving yourself something to think about, or if you want to engage in a philosophical discussion, definitely this book is worth reading. Otherwise, don't read it. Really. That's my take. Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. 5 stars. I'll definitely read more Nietzsche. Ecce Homo next, because it's in the same book.